morning, Mercy View. My name is Jema, and I am a partner here at Mercy View. I'm going to be reading this morning from 1 Samuel 17, which can be found on page 137 of the blue Bibles there on the floor in front of you. If you need a Bible for yourself or for someone else, please feel free to take that with you. It's our gift to you. I'm going to be reading selected passages from chapter 17, and I will tell you the verses to kind of guide you as we go along through this exciting chapter. Now, 1 Samuel 17. Now, the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered, and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in a line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me." Now, moving down to verse 19. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines, and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. Now reading from verses 26 to 27. And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So it shall be done to the man who kills him." Reading from verse 31. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him." "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now reading at verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. This ends the reading of God's word.
Praise be to God. Well, one of my favorite movies that probably most of you have seen here, it's an old movie, by the way, is a movie that has a character in it by the name of the Cowardly Lion. You know this movie if you have been around movies, The Wizard of Oz. And it is a classic. I mean, somewhere over the rainbow. Like, how can you beat that, right? But to be honest, some of that stuff in The Wizard of Oz was pretty terrifying as a kid. I mean, flying monkeys, right? Houses landing on witches, a witch melting from water. I mean, as a kid, I'm not so sure I had the categories like in my brain and in my heart for that. That was pretty terrifying stuff. But of all the characters in that movie, the one that always struck me was the Cowardly Lion, right? Here was a lion whose roar had been swallowed really by fear. And in his eyes, courage was the key to his transformation. He knew that he needed it. He thought, man, this is the thing that's going to erase a lifetime of trembling from fear. You know the song that he sings, right, in the movie? It's courage is the thing that makes the elephant charge his tusk in the mighty mist or the dusky dusk, and makes the muskrat guard his musk, right? But you do remember what the wizard said to him at the end of the movie. Like, whenever the Cowardly Lion finally reached the person that he thought could help him, this is what the wizard said to him about courage. This is straight from the script from the movie. He says, courage is like the men who take their fortitude out of mothballs and parade it down the main street of the city. What does that mean? Well, it means just believe you have courage and you'll have it. Now, is that right? Where does courage actually come from? Like, is it something that we sort of just rustle up on our own? It's something we find within ourselves? Or is it something beyond ourselves? Is it something found outside of ourselves? Where do we get courage? Today we are continuing our series in the book of 1 Samuel. Probably, you just heard Jaba do an excellent job of reading this, probably one of the most famous stories in all of the scriptures. And I want to invite you to see a couple of things as we look at this very well-known passage. And the first one is this: fear of man flees where the zeal of God reigns. The fear of man flees, it runs away, where zeal, passion, courage for God reigns. But second, I want to invite you to see this. Godly courage rises where the zeal for God abides. Godly courage rises up. It's awakened where zeal for God abides, or maybe we could say has been cultivated. So if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, keep them open there to 1 Samuel 17. And as you're looking there, here's where we find ourselves in our story today. The nation of Israel is in shambles. Saul is still king, but it is a hollow kingship. And David, the shepherd boy, the youngest of Jesse's 7 sons, has been privately anointed as king. He has also then providentially been invited into the palace, the courts of Saul, as Saul's personal harp player and armor bearer, confidant. And so still at this moment, the nation of Israel is stuck in limbo. They are paralyzed by fear. They're practically leaderless in every way that matters. And they are desperately in need of a deliverer. In fact, we see today that they're back in battle with a thorn that has been in their side in the past. We've seen it in the book of 1 Samuel, the Philistines. And this really sets up, again, one of the most famous stories in all of the Bible. So look with me, if you would, there at verses kind of 1 through 11. I'm not going to read all that again, but just kind of keep that open. What we have here is a military standoff between the Philistines and the Israelites. They're both stationed on either side of a mountain, on either side of a valley. They're each on mountains. And in the book of 1 Samuel, as we just said, the Philistines have not been friendly to the Israelites. We actually haven't seen them in a while, but they're still around, and now they're actually back in battle with the Israelites. And I want you to look, actually, if you would, at verse 4. At this point in the game, the Philistines have figured out we need to intimidate the Israelites, and so they bring out there, as the passage you heard read, their champion, Goliath, a giant from a place called Gath, to intimidate the Israelites. Now, the word champion in the Bible, and really in ancient Near Eastern literature, meant a person who would step out to fight on behalf of their entire army. Like, that one person would represent the entire army. But Goliath, as you know, if you're familiar with the story, was no ordinary champion, right? It says that his height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, that's a different kind of measurement system than we use, but what commentators believe is that likely put Goliath at about 10 feet tall. Now, the average height for people in the ancient Near East at this point was likely around 5 feet 5 inches. All right, so Goliath, I mean, this is obvious, I know, but let me just say it out loud. Obviously, Goliath literally towered over everybody. I remember as a kid watching, I think he's still considered the tallest basketball player ever to play the game. Anybody know the name Manute Bol? Yeah? 7'7". Played in the eBay, remember him playing for, at the time, it was the Washington Bullets. Goliath was over 2 feet taller than the tallest player to ever play in the NBA. I remember I would watch Manute Bol play, and he was like otherworldly. It didn't even look real. You know, he was so tall. Goliath was even bigger. He was a giant. And here's why it's important, though, that you need to know that he came from a place called Gath. And you don't have to turn there, but if you go back to Joshua 11, we actually have the 2 faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb, who drive out most of the giants in Canaan at the time. These giants go by the name of the Anakim, but they don't drive them all out. And one of the cities that the Anakim, these giants, were still living in was a place, you guessed it, called Gath. And so Gath is Philistine territory, and Goliath, in a sense then, he's representing not just the Philistines, but the giants that even Joshua did not fully defeat. Now notice the armor. You heard Jama read this too. The armor that Goliath was wearing in verses 5 through 7. Bronze from head to toe. And this is what we're supposed to see. These are like symbols of strength for sure, but they are not the symbols of a supernatural kind. Right? It's the armor of man. It's representing that Goliath and the Philistines, they trusted in human strength, in human might. And it says that Goliath stood and shouted a challenge to the Israelites in verse 8. As the champion of the Philistines, as the representative, he says, one-on-one combat with your best guy, winner takes all. And when the Israelites heard this, as it says in verse 11, it says that they were absolutely paralyzed with fear. And I think I would understand that on some level. Goliath's a big dude. He's strong. He's tall. The stakes of the fight probably would have also been a factor, like the losers in this passage would become the slaves to the winner. So the stakes are high. There's a lot going on here. The Israelites, taking all that into account, are scared out of their minds. Now, here's what is interesting in our passage. We kind of look at, it's like in a movie where you see a span of time go by really fast, but what happens next is, over the next 40 days, Goliath, it says he would come forward in the morning and in the evening, and he would taunt the Israelites. He would taunt them. He would say the same thing that we just said. Hey, pick your best guy. Winner takes all. Whoever loses has to be the servants of the winners. Does this for 40 days in the morning and the night. And the 40 days is no accident. We should notice something there. It's significant. It's a significant time length in the Bible as a period of judgment and testing, right? Think of the flood. Think of Israel wandering in the wilderness. Think of Jesus in the wilderness himself before his public ministry. But what we do see in our passage, that over these 40 days, there is no record of any Israelite making a peep. None of them stepped up. None of them came forward. Now, sandwiched around all of this, we see Jesse's 3 oldest sons have followed Saul into battle. And Jesse has instructed his youngest son, David, the shepherd boy, to take some food to them, to bring them some sustenance, to help them, have energy for the fight. And so David shows up on the scene in verse 20 to do that very thing. But instead of just delivering the goods, he's stunned by what he sees. And he's shocked by what he hears, right? There is this giant, that alone would have been shocking, but a giant that is challenging the mighty men of Israel, and seeing that the chosen people of God are trembling before this giant. And now 26 is a very key verse. I actually do want you to look at this. Let me read that again for us. David says this about what he is witnessing. He says, "What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living?" That word reproach there in verse 26 is key. What is reproach? Well, reproach is a form of dishonor or disgrace that arises when someone or something is subject to public scorn or mockery. And in David's case, he wasn't just bothered by Israel's reputation being tarnished in this moment. He was more concerned, bothered, I would even maybe argue righteously angry, that God's reputation was being mocked. Now, what are we supposed to see in this first half of 1 Samuel 17? Well, I think it's where we just finished. David's righteous anger because of Goliath's defiance of God's name. Are you with me? And that really brings me to the first thing that I want you to see this morning. Fear of man flees where the zeal of God, or zeal for God, reigns. Now, what is zeal? Zeal is a word also we don't use a whole lot. It is a biblical word. You'll see it pop up often in the scriptures. One way to say it, particularly in the context that we are looking at it this morning, is this. It's righteous indignation, righteous boldness in defending the namesake of God, the honor of God, the glory of God. And that's what David is doing here when he asks these questions. When he says, what shall be done for this giant who's killing Philistines and taking away the reproach from Israel? Right? Now that's the reproach from Israel. But then he goes on, but for who is this Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? See, David here has a righteous anger that is rooted in his unshakable confidence in God's greatness. It's what transformed him into the warrior that we're going to see today. Now, you remember last week, this work that God is doing in the life of David in many ways is hidden. There's a secret sanctification that is happening in the fields, and we're going to actually continue to see this in the palace. But even at this point in the life of David, he is so passionate about the name of God that he is willing to ask the question, why isn't anybody challenging the giant? What's wrong with you guys? Do you not care about the name of God? See, David wasn't calculating his odds with Goliath in this moment. He was measuring Goliath's threats against the Lord's power. He was measuring the taunting of Goliath by the Lord's glory and strength. And so for David, unlike the other Philistines, Saul even, it reframed the battlefield for him. He did not see the same thing that the Philistines saw. That the Israelites saw. David knew deep in his spirit that the giant was no match for God. So I wonder, do you have that kind of zeal for the Lord? Do you care about the name of the Lord? If not, or you're like, I don't even know what that means, Brad, what would it look like if you did? What would have to change in your life to begin to cultivate and to build a passion and a zeal for God so that the things that you look at in your life that are big are reframed? It would look a lot like what it looks like in the life of David. You would have to stop measuring your challenges by your circumstances, by your fears, and start to measure them by God's greatness. Fear of man flees where zeal for God reigns. Now look with me, if you would, beginning in verse 28. Here we see a confrontation between Jesse's oldest son, Eliab, and David. And David, really undeterred by this, continues to move forward. I think Eliab, in a way, was jealous. He accuses David of having evil motives, right? Dismissing him like he's just sort of this simple shepherd boy. What does he have to give? It's the same spirit that his dad had last chapter, right? But look with me, if you would, at verse 32. The shepherd boy's zeal for God continues to shepherd him. And let me read for us. Here's what it says again. This is David speaking. He says, "Let no man's heart fail because of him," Goliath. "Your servant, me, I will go and I'll fight with this Philistine." In other words, David says, I'm not leaving God's name in the dust. While you guys cower in fear, I'm going to meet Goliath, and I'll be your champion, if you'll allow it. And he says, if no one else is going to fight for God's honor, I'll do it. Now, Saul wasn't so sure. Right? David informs Saul, though, that as a shepherd, he's actually chased down lions and bears that had snatched his sheep, and he's killed them. I think in the ESV, when you see it say that he snatched them by the beards, that means, I think, in my sanctified imagination, that David is killing these things with his own hands. Now, it does say that he struck them, and so I do think some of what we see in our story today, he was also probably using a sling and stone to do some of this work. We can at least say this. David is getting in the ditch with the bears and the lions to protect what was precious to him. And David says, boldly, that Goliath is going to be just like one of those beasts. Why? Not just because he's impugning the honor of the Israelites, but because he is defying God. Now again, we see the zeal of David here. Not only does he want to defy the one who has defied God, but if you look at verse 37, he knows something here. He knows that the same God that gave him victory over the wild beasts in the fields as a shepherd can deliver him from a beast of a man. That is absolutely faith-fueled courage, because let's be honest, there are big bears. But a giant, even compared to that, still requires faith-filled courage that God is going to come through for him like he did for David in the fields. And so Saul says, well, I guess you're our best shot. You're the only one that stepped forward. And he starts to outfit him in his armor, Saul's armor. But notice that David says, yeah, this isn't working for me. This isn't going to, I can't use this. I think he talks about it wasn't tested. It was because David was unfamiliar with the armor. It was unproven to him. And so he takes it off. The very thing that you would want on probably if you're going to battle a giant is some armor. And he takes off the armor and instead takes his shepherd's staff in his hand, goes down to a brook, a small creek, and he chooses 5 smooth stones. And he puts those stones in a shepherd's pouch, and he begins to walk toward Goliath with his shepherd's sling. Some commentators believe that David took 5 stones, because you might wonder, he knew he was just going to go fight Goliath. Why did he need 5? Did he think that he needed some other, bullets in the chamber? And here's what some commentators believe, and I love this, and this is also sanctified imagination stuff here. But in 2 Samuel 21, which, by the way, we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel after 1 Samuel next year at some point. It tells us there in 2 Samuel 21 that David knew that Goliath had 4 giant relatives. Some people they say it's his sons, but not real sure that's true, but it's at least they're relatives of Goliath. And in my sanctified imagination, I think David was ready to take out all 5 of them if he needed to. And so what did he need for that? He needed 1 stone for each. What confidence, right? Now Goliath sees David, and it actually says that Goliath has contempt on David because of his youthful appearance. And I think what we're supposed to see there is that basically Goliath is looking at David and thinking, what a mismatch. This is your choice to come and battle with me? And notice what David says there in verse 42. Or what he says to David, there in verse 42. He says, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Now when Goliath asks David that question, he was saying, you're treating me as if I'm a nobody, a non-entity, if this is your challenger for me. But it may actually be even worse than that. Now keep this PG-13, but the Hebrew word for dog here is the same word that's also used to describe a male homosexual prostitute. You go back to the book of Deuteronomy, and there were certain cults that practiced this. This same word was used to describe this. And so some believe that that's just how offended Goliath was. That he would say, am I a dog like that? That you would send me this guy to do battle with me. But not only that, when he says that he will give David's flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the fields, he is actually unknowingly prophesying what will happen upon his death. Much in the same way when emperors would kill people in their day and they would throw their bodies out to be devoured by dogs and birds. So Goliath is trying to strip David of all of his dignity with his words here. It was a part of a plan to belittle him and intimidate him as an unworthy opponent. So what does David do? Does he say, you got a good point, Goliath. I think I'm going to back out and let you have your way with us, the Israelites? No. Look at verse 45. David's words here, y'all, drip with holy defiance. He says, sure, Goliath, you come with natural weapons, but I come armed in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. Now, you may remember back in 1 Samuel chapter 1, we see this title of Lord of hosts pop up. And the title is a description that the Philistines would have known. They've seen the Lord of hosts defeat them in the past. And what this phrase means, the Lord of hosts, is that God is the commander of heaven's armies. He is Israel's true leader in battle. And David goes further. He doesn't just predict victory. He announces that he is going to humiliate Goliath. He said, I'm going to cut off your head, and I'm going to feed your carcass to the scavengers. So an incensed Goliath charges towards David there in verse 48. And it says that David also ran quickly to the battle line without hesitation, once again showing his zeal for the Lord. And this is really, if you know the story, this is the crescendo of the story. And almost like, as you're reading, it's almost like it's in slow motion. In the shadow of Goliath, David grabs a stone, he loads his sling, and he lets it fly. It says that the stone sunk into Goliath's forehead. The giant from Gath then crashes face down, instantly dead. Just like the serpent in Eden, Goliath was exalting himself and blaspheming God, and now, like the serpent, he has been thrown down on his belly. And then notice verse 50. The writer reiterates, there was no sword in David's hand. As if to say, remember, no earthly weapons were necessarily needed here. Just the zeal of a shepherd and the power of God. And then David did what he said he was going to do in verse 51. He stood over Goliath. He took the giant's own sword and severed his head, and that sealed the victory. And then in complete terror, the Philistines run away. Israel roars in triumph, and David carries the head of Goliath away from the scene as a trophy. Now, I want to point out a couple of quick things here that I think are fascinating to see in this part of 1 Samuel 17. It's actually, the first thing is I want to return to something I mentioned earlier. David's battle with Goliath wasn't just some random fight. It was the culmination of, up to this point, of Israel's unfinished task to rid the land of the Anakim, the giants who were supposed to be driven out by Joshua. Remember that Goliath was a remnant of those enemies that were now aligned with the Philistines. So listen, by defeating Goliath, David wasn't just defeating an enemy, a Philistine, a person. He was completing the work that Joshua had started, marking the end of a long-standing threat to Israel at this point in their history. But second, if you look in the Bible, the idea of stoning in God's law was, most of the time, it was considered a divine judgment. It was considered the punishment for idolaters, for blasphemers. So, when David slayed Goliath, he became Israel's hand of justice on behalf of God. David was executing judgment on this sacrilegious giant whose defiance against God's holy name was offensive. So David wasn't just a national hero in this moment. He was used by God as an instrument of divine reckoning, God's avenger of justice on earth. Now, a typical sermon on David and Goliath at this point would go like this. What are the giants in your life? And then I would go on to tell you how to slay those giants in your life. And although we're going to get there in some respects here in just a moment, that's not what this passage is mainly about. So let me get at it this way. If you had to choose what character or characters in our story that best describe you, who would it be? Would it be Goliath, if you're honest? Like, you would admit that at times or often you're arrogant, you're defiant against God, you're trusting in your own strength to save? Or maybe it's Saul. We didn't really get a ton of Saul in our passage today, but what we did get of him is that he is the king of fear. He's still, it's a hollow kingship right now, but he is still over the nation of Israel as king. He is absolutely paralyzed by fear. Maybe that's your story. Afraid to act in faith. What about David's brothers? You're quick to scorn other people for their desire to live faithfully. Slow to step up when a challenge or a need arises. Or maybe you would say, Brad, I kind of feel like I'm David. By the way, that'd be a courageous thing to say this morning in light of David. But you say, I'm bold. I'm relying on God's power. I like to stand where no one else will. I hope that's some of your story. Well, I think, and this is a little sneaky here, but hear me out on this. I think if we were to be really honest this morning, there's another group of people that we really identify with. And it's a group that, as you're reading it, kind of feels like it's in the background, but it's actually in the foreground for us this morning if we think about who we really identify with, and it's this. It's the Israelite army. You and I are the ones that tremble on the sidelines often. You and I are often paralyzed by fear to the point of inaction. We are the ones that hear the giants in our lives taunting us and threatening us over and over again, and we hide from it. We are, in many ways, the Israelites. Now, a typical sermon would also say, yes, we see David had the courage here to take on Goliath, but Christian, you're no David. In other words, it's tempting, they would say, to reduce the story to an example that you can't live up to. Like, we shouldn't make it about the courage of David. Or if we do want to talk about courage, it's something that you really don't want to look at too long as a form of something that you should emulate or imitate. But I think if you bring the two things together that we just said, you are the fearful Israelite, but you aren't or can't be David, it leads to this. Where's the hope? I actually think it can be a self-defeating narrative that strips the story of David of its power. Here's what I mean. To assume that if we talk about something like courage, that we turn the story that we've just looked at into be better, be braver, I think it is an adventure in missing the point. To see David's courage and want to emulate it, friend, is not to moralize it. It's to recognize the pattern of, listen, godliness that we see in David is the same kind that we are called to walk in as well. Because the same God, listen, that enabled David to have this courage desires to enable you. I'll go even further. Courage in the Scriptures is at times commanded of God's people. Joshua 1 is a place you can see that. When God commands us to fear not in the New Testament, to be of good cheer, to have courage is another way to say that. He is commanding against fear, which is the opposite of courage. To have courage actually is a command. So here's what I'm saying to you. You are supposed to see the courage of David in this passage. You are supposed to see the boldness of a man who feared God more than giants, who acted on the promises of God, not the size of his opponent. You are supposed to see what happens when faith eclipses fear. When trust in God, God's power sparks obedience. But you're also supposed to see where this courage comes from. David's courage wasn't self-made. It flowed from his confidence in the Lord. His story shows us that true courage comes not from who we are, but from whose we are. He couldn't help but be courageous. Why? He had seen God's faithfulness in the fields. When he faced the lions and the bears, victories like that taught him to trust God in everything. And this brings me to the second thing I want to invite you to see this morning. Godly courage rises where a zeal for God abides. In the moment that it was needed, David's courage was awakened because he had already been cultivating it long before this moment. So are you cultivating a passion for God right now? Are you growing a passion for God now so that when difficulty comes, when a giant comes into your life, courage naturally rises up within you? Now, there is another story happening under the surface of 1 Samuel 17. Did you notice that Goliath was wrapped in bronze from head to toe? This kind of armor would have been called scale armor, and it meant it was made of overlapping scales of bronze. Scales, listen, like a serpent. See, Goliath in our story is actually a living, breathing echo of the serpent of Eden. Or better, the dragon of Revelation 12. In Revelation 12, Satan himself is described this way: the great dragon who was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. And so, in our story, this dragon serpent is a picture of the one that God promised would have his head crushed in Genesis 3. And because the giant that blasphemed God, just like the serpent in Eden, this mimics this story, the cosmic clash between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And maybe the most fascinating part of this scaly armor of bronze was his helmet. If Goliath, the dragon warrior, stands here to be judged by God through David, then the helmet on his head isn't just armor, it's a verdict. Like the serpent in Eden, his head is marked for a stoning, a crushing from a shepherd boy. And then you enter David, rejected by his brothers, and by all human appearances, no strength to speak of. But he steps into combat with Goliath, not with a legion of angels, but with humility. A humility that spurred courage, that did not count himself more significant than others. See, David is a living, breathing echo of Jesus. A Christ figure, wielding a weapon that the world, think Goliath, right? His armor, his sword, scorns. A shadow of the cross itself. This really does show us this story, the turning tide of a cosmic battle against sin, striking at the head of the serpent, declaring victory for God's people. Like David, Jesus enters enemy territory, unafraid, to do what no one else could do or would do. Secure victory for his people. Both were seen, both Jesus, David, as unfit and unqualified, yet through them, God's enemies were routed and his people freed. See, the message that David and Goliath foreshadows is crystal clear in our passage this morning. The battle belongs to the Lord. Through his victory, we now find peace and freedom. The Redeemer warrior, the serpent crusher, the anointed avenger of evil has struck the decisive blow, securing a victory for all who will trust in him for an eternity. See, all of the heroes of the faith, like David, this is a very important principle that you need to get this morning, do a kind of double duty in the scriptures for us. They spur us on to our own faith, like this is why it's okay for us to say we can look to David and have him spur us to be more courageous, but they also point us to Christ. That's the double duty that the heroes of the faith do. You don't have to choose between the two. Imitation and obedience is good, and pointing to Jesus is very good. And we can say it's good and right for us to pursue courage in Jesus. So what kind of courage do you need? And let's land here as we close. Like, what kind of courage do you need today for whatever you're facing? Let's think quickly just about the different kinds of courage we see in our story today with David. First, we see in David that courage trusts. Where do we as a church need to reinforce our lives with the faithfulness of God today? Where do you need to do that? Next, we see in our story today that courage confronts. What lies, what fears, what strongholds do you need to boldly resist, standing firm in the truth of God's promises? What lies or fears or strongholds do we as a church need to boldly resist in the days to come? Next, and this is an important one, we see in David that courage speaks. What truths do you need to proclaim boldly in a world that's lost its way? As a church, what kind of truths in the days ahead are we going to need to speak courageously towards? Here's another important one. We see in David that courage acts. Speaking is a form of acting, but this question would be, what areas in your life is God calling you to boldly step forward in faith and obedience? As a church, we need to be thinking about that for ourselves as well. Where is God leading us to boldly step forward in faith, trusting him? And then lastly, we see in David that courage glorifies. What giants in your life is God calling you to face today, so that his glory might be revealed through your obedience? We need to ask that question of our church. What are we facing that God is calling us to step up to and to obey him in, so that his glory might be made known? See, courage doesn't shrink, it rises. Courage never hesitates, it charges. It speaks when silence would be a lot easier. It acts when others retreat, and it glorifies when the world demands silence. What kind of courage will you need, will we need in the days ahead? David's life shouts the answer today. Courage is never about you. It's about him. The giants, the battles, the difficulties that you're walking through, none of it is ever a match for God's might. What matters is that we never forget that the God who fought for David is the same God fighting with us and for us today. Your gaze must never rest on the size of the giant, but on the sufficiency of God. Mercy, in the days ahead, we will face giants. You will face giants individually, in your family, in your workplace, your home. But we as a church will face these too. And the question is not, are those giants too big, but is our God too small? And the answer to that question is nothing is impossible with God. The battle has never been ours to win. It's always been his. David's courage came not from himself, but from the Lord of hosts. And that same courage is yours. It's ours for the taking. So we move forward, not in fear, but in boldness, knowing the God who crushed Goliath can lead us into victory as well. So will you stand like David? Filled with zeal for the name of the Lord, knowing your courage is fueled by his unshakable promise? I hope your answer to that question is yes. And here's why it can be yes. Because the battle is his, and he wins every time. Let's pray together.